Russia thought that its slow and steady rate of advance would win the Ukraine war. It had no intention of being the hare in this race. Russia was more than happy to be the tortoise, albeit one that moved so slowly that even that famous reptile would blush. Ukraine just broke the tortoise's shell. Using a brand new assault tactic, Ukraine has just ripped through the Russian front in Zaporizhia. It achieved a 3.5-kilometer breakthrough in one brutal push that will have Vladimir Putin wondering what on earth just happened. News of that push comes from United 24 media, which said on October 12th that Ukraine's specially created assault troops have done exactly what they were designed to do. They've pushed back against the Russian defenses, applying so much pressure that those defenses broke so thoroughly that Ukraine was able to liberate a village. That village is Mali Shebaki, which is now hosting the Ukrainian 24th Separate Assault Battalion, also known as IDAR, which operates alongside Ukraine's 33rd Separate Assault Regiment. Together, those units destroyed the Russian forces in Mali Shebaki so decisively that they were able to roll into the village and once again raise the Ukrainian flag. We see that in a reel shared on Facebook, which announced Mali's liberation along with a message. Units of the 24th Separate Assault Battalion IDAR, together with their brothers-in-arms from the 33rd Separate Assault Regiment, raised the Ukrainian flag in the settlement of Mali Shebaki in the Zaporizhia front, the post declared. The settlement is under the control of the Defense Forces of Ukraine. The post hailed the coordination of the two units involved, which we can see in the use of the Ukrainian word pobratimami. This word loosely translates to brothers-in-arms, showcasing that Ukraine's new assault strategy is bonding these troops better than ever before. Russia may attack in uncoordinated waves to get results. Ukraine counters Russia's gains through teamwork, dedication, and an ability to unleash coordinated hell on its opponents. Remember the name Shebaki too. We'll be coming back to that in a moment. For now, there's a certain level of extra symbolism attached to Ukraine's act of raising its flag in the recaptured village. Such an act is common, of course. Raising a flag has always been a symbol of victory. However, Ukraine may have just used this opportunity to counter something Russia has been doing with increasing frequency in recent months: infiltrating villages to falsely raise flags even though Russia hasn't captured anything. We need only take a look at what happened at Verbova to see that new Russian tactic in action. At the beginning of October, Russia claimed that its troops had captured the small village. This is the settlement of Verbova that is in the Dnipropetrovsk region of Ukraine, rather than its more famous cousin in the Zaporizhia region. Russia was lying, as the handful of its soldiers who entered Verbova were destroyed by Ukraine within minutes. Russia's propaganda play with the fake flag raising is explored in one of our videos, so check it out if you want to learn more. But you only really need to know two things. Russia fakes its flag raising, Ukraine does it because it recaptures territory. Further confirmation that Mali Shebaki is in Ukraine's hands comes from Colonel Valentin Manko, who leads the Assault Forces Directorate of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In a Facebook video, he confirmed that the Mali Shebaki assault was a success, in addition to adding some extra information. Manko says that Ukraine also managed to clear the nearby and the similarly named village of Shebaki during its assault, which is why we told you to remember the name. Plus, Ukraine's assault troops also managed to partially liberate another small village named Stepova, making October 12th an extremely productive day for Ukraine as it attempts to push deeper into occupied parts of Zaporizhia. A productive day for Ukraine is a very bad day for Russia, and Manko explained just how bad. The village clearances and liberations were part of a concerted Ukrainian push into Zaporizhia that saw it regain a large amount of territory in a single day. As Euromaidan press reports, Ukraine managed to move 3.5 kilometers forward into Zaporizhia along a 5-kilometer line of the front. That amounts to a 3.1-mile-wide contingent of Ukraine's forces pushing just over 2 miles into Zaporizhia, demolishing Russian forces as they went, and perhaps setting the stage for more assaults in the future. This wasn't just a very bad day for Russia, it was outright painful. As CNN reported on October 1st, Russia was already having to deal with the pace of its advance slowing substantially following a summer offensive that failed to achieve any of the objectives that Putin had outlined for his troops. September saw Russia take just 259 square kilometers of Ukraine for the entire month, which amounts to about 100 square miles. That was 44% less territory than Russia managed to occupy in August, which brings us back to what Ukraine just achieved. Russia advancing slowly means that every piece of territory it gains is like gold dust to Putin, as he attempts to create the perception that Ukraine can't stop Russia from winning the war. When Russia loses territory to Ukraine's counter-assaults, that perception is shattered. Mali Shebaki just proved that Ukraine is just as capable of taking terrain as Russia, and with Ukraine's new assault strategy, this may just be the beginning of Putin's problems. We'll revisit the topic of Ukraine's new assaults later in the video, but before that, the recapture of Mali Shebaki and the surrounding villages will hurt Russia for another reason. as Euromaidan Press points out. It says that Russia had only managed to reach the outskirts of Mali Shebaki and the surrounding villages as recently as March 2025, following a push into the nearby settlement of Pyatikati. That March push had allowed Russia to advance 4 kilometers deep into Ukraine across a 10-kilometer front line. Ukraine struck back, the outlet says, retaking Shebaki in the process, but the village was subjected to a counter-assault by Russia in July, leading to Russia seizing the territory that Ukraine had mostly just regained. So this wasn't any old counteroffensive by Ukraine. It was the period at the end of a run-on sentence that was being written as far as March of this year. The back and forth over these villages is over, at least for now, and it's Ukraine that has come out on top. On the surface, what Ukraine achieved on October 12th may look fairly small. Liberating a couple of villages is great, as is managing such a deep push through the Russian lines, but it still all amounts to a fairly small amount of territory. However, taking a wider view of the Ukraine war reveals that Ukraine liberating Mali Shebaki is just one part of a much larger trend happening all across the country right now. Ukraine is on the counterattack, and it's been slowly clawing its territory back from the occupying Russian forces for months. We only need to look at what's happening in Dobropilya and Donetsk right now to see that. On October 10th, United 24 media reported on comments made by the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky. Those comments were made during a field visit 2 days earlier, with Syrsky revealing that a full Ukrainian counteroffensive is happening as we speak. In Dobropilya, Ukraine has managed to liberate around 180 square kilometers, or about 69.4 square miles, all as a result of Ukraine's increasingly effective assaults. In Donetsk, the liberation is going even better. About 212.9 square kilometers have been liberated in that sector of the war, Syrsky says, which amounts to around 82 square miles. So what we saw on October 12th isn't an isolated incident. It's Ukraine continuing an approach in Zaporizhia that has already been proven to work in Dobropilya and Donetsk. Russia is claiming settlements with limited numbers of troops, and Ukraine is starting to make it pay with its counter-assaults. This is happening all across the country, and the retaking of Mali Shebaki may just be the first in what is soon to become a long line of liberations that will leave Putin fuming. This isn't what the fall of 2025 was supposed to look like. The season was supposed to be one of celebration after Russia took enormous amounts of territory during the summer. Instead, Ukraine is reversing every gain that Russia made during the summer, forcing Putin even further away from the goals that he'd already failed to achieve earlier in the year. All of this is being made possible by something we mentioned earlier in the video. Ukraine has new assault tactics, and the numbers show us that these tactics are working. In its report on what Ukraine managed to achieve in Mali Shebaki, Militani summed up what Ukraine is doing differently with its assaults, which allows it to regain so much territory. It reports that Ukraine has assault troops that it's now using as a tool to break through Russia's defenses and mobile reserves in several regions. In all cases, these assault troops are experiencing so much success because of a change in tactics being operated by Russia. The Moscow Times reported on these changes back in September, noting that Russia is trying to use what the outlet calls sabotage groups to penetrate deep through the front. It quotes Syrsky, who says, "Since the beginning of summer, there has been a change in the enemy's tactics. Their main task is to penetrate as deeply as possible into our territory, to withdraw, regroup, and advance again. Then attack targets deep inside to paralyze our logistics and troop rotations." Militani adds that these Russian units can be as small as 4 or 6 soldiers, with Russia's goal seeming to be to sneak its troops through the front lines rather than fully break them. It's an approach that works. Sort of. Russia is indeed managing to claim small settlements and other scraps of territory with these sabotage groups. The fact that these Russian units are so small also means they can make so many small gains that it all adds up to numbers that look fairly impressive on the surface. However, the downside of Russia's approach is being exposed by Ukraine right now. Small units aren't able to really entrench themselves in a territory to erect the kinds of defenses that can stop Ukraine from counterattacking. Russia's infiltration units aren't backed by armor, and the holes they punch into the front lines are so narrow that Ukraine is able to close them quickly. Once the holes are closed, Russia's soldiers are encircled and prevented from gaining access to supplies or reinforcements. Ukraine launches its assaults. Russia's forces lose the territory they had claimed. Ukraine has created a brand new branch of its military to conduct these territory-regaining assaults, and it works differently from the Air Assault Forces, or DSHV as Syrsky explains. The air assault troops are an elite infantry unit that can attack, defend and raid, the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief says. And assault units are rapid reaction units. They operate where it's most difficult, do not have fixed defense lines and are called upon to break through the enemy's first line. Russia wants to infiltrate. Ukraine is now countering with small units of its own that react in real time to every advance that Russia makes. Writing in his Medium column, The Strategic Edge, former US soldier and federal agent Brian Eislin goes into even deeper depth on Ukraine's new assault forces. He says that Ukraine has built a mobile reserve that is free-flowing and active in all parts of the country. That reserve is designed specifically to break Russian defenses, particularly in regions where Russia has made gains as a result of its use of smaller units. These assault forces aren't fighting with the rest of Ukraine's troops. They're not battling on the front lines or defending against Russia's advances. Instead, they're dedicating themselves to launching attacks, and they've been exceptionally successful over the last couple of months. The retaking of Mali Shabaki is just the latest in a long line of examples of these new assault forces being used. Eislin says that several Ukrainian outlets have reported that these new assault forces all work by the same blueprint. Small assault groups, lots of night work, flanking rather than frontal pushes, and immediate handoffs to heavier units once the door is open, is what Ukraine is doing, according to Eislin. That may sound familiar. Russia is trying to do the same thing, only it's been failing. We mentioned earlier that Ukraine has made cutting off the gaps on the front lines that Russia's infiltrators create a part of its strategy. Without those gaps, Russia can't send reinforcements or heavy units it needs to make its gains more permanent. Ukraine doesn't have that problem. Its assault groups are doing the same thing that Russia's groups are doing, only they have the muscle backing them up to make it work. Perhaps this is a symptom of Ukraine's defensive posture versus Russia's offensive one. Russia may not be able to make its new strategy work because it's stretching itself too thin with its offensives, and as United 24 media noted in October, Russia has already burned through most of its armor. Russia's heavy units may not be coming because they're simply not there. Ukraine, on the other hand, appears to have the heavy units it needs, and its assault groups succeed because they're supporting the defenses behind them rather than acting independently. Yes, the assault groups are roaming around Ukraine, however, they're being deployed in specific areas where recaptures are possible, as was noted all the way back in the 24th Separate Assault Battalion's Facebook post. Ukraine's assault groups are coordinating with their comrades to ensure that every recapture sticks. Supporting Ukraine's new approach to assaults is a shift in how the country trains its infantry. The Kyiv Post highlighted this in an October 10th report, where it said that these changes in training have come about because the Ukraine war battlefield is evolving. The outlet points out that drones have become the main threat in the war, which has resulted in infantry units often staying inside fortified trenches rather than launching the all-out assaults they had in the past. This is a challenge that affects both sides. As Army Technology notes, drones are now responsible for up to 80% of the casualties in the war, making the sort of large assaults Russia used to favor a near impossibility. There are just too many unmanned vehicles ready to take out troops and armor to make those types of assaults viable from a manpower and equipment perspective. Ukraine isn't immune to this proliferation of drones, as Russia is using plenty of fiber optic and first-person view drones of its own, hence the small Russian infiltration units and Ukraine's similarly small new assault groups. Still, infantry has to recapture territory, the Kyiv Post notes. That's one of the few things that drones can't do, at least not yet. The outlet notes that Ukraine's new infantry training has transformed how the country approaches infantry-based warfare. Obvious changes come from changes in weaponry. Ukraine's forces no longer train using the old Soviet-era weapons they used to in the past. Western-style weapons are now the norm, and Ukraine is using these weapons to make its soldiers more effective. As a soldier with the call sign Chasik tells the Kyiv Post, the guys have become higher level, both on the range and in combat. They've become more, effective. Without training, it will be extremely difficult in battle. More effective soldiers also lead to better coordination. Ukraine's main training now has its infantry units working in small groups. They fire from various distances before retreating to a work location. These drills seem to be custom-made for Ukraine's new assault forces. Those small units are getting in, firing on and taking out Russian troops, and then withdrawing to allow Ukraine's heavier units to retake territory. Accuracy combined with speed is what Ukraine's infantry training aims for, and we're starting to see the impact of its approach on the battlefield. Ukraine is using these new tactics for defense as well as offense. The Kyiv Post spoke to another soldier with the call sign Shambhala, who explained more. Each exercise is about survival, both for each of them and for the group as a whole. A small group can inflict much greater damage than an entire infantry company. Our training principle is called lone soldier in the field, Shambhala says. One person, moving, knowing, camouflage, knowing the technical characteristics of his weapon, reading the enemy's intent, can strike, withdraw, strike again, withdraw again, so we can hold back the enemy with a small, mobile, survivable group. Once again, Ukraine is showing its ability to adapt to everything that Russia tries. The very training tactics that Ukraine uses to aid its defense now appear to be what its new assault groups use to retake territory. Coming back to Mali Shebaki, Ukraine will also be happy to reclaim any territory in Zaporizhia because of what Russia is doing at the nuclear power plant in that region. Russia managed to capture this plant near the beginning of the war, and it's held it ever since. Now it seems that Russia is trying to cut that plant off from the Ukrainian grid, and it's succeeding. As the Kyiv Independent reported on October 12th, Russia has taken the unprecedented step of deliberately breaking the connection between the Ukrainian power grid and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. There was no intelligent decoupling that happened here. It appears that Russia managed to cut the cord literally by striking a power line on September 23rd. Since then, the plant has been operating on backup diesel generators. This is incredibly dangerous and seems to be a sign that Russia is attempting to connect the plant to its own power grid, as Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Shebaya said in an ex-post. Not only is this an attempted theft of a peaceful Ukrainian nuclear facility, unauthorized actions of Russia's state nuclear energy corporation Rosatom violate internationally recognized nuclear safety protocols, contradict Ukrainian license, and directly threaten a nuclear incident, Shebaya proclaimed. These Russian actions place Mali Shebaki in a new perspective. This may seem like one small village in Zaporizhia that Ukraine has managed to liberate, but in the grander scheme of what's happening in the region, a 3-kilometer push forward across 5 kilometers of the front line is an important step in the right direction for Ukraine. It brings the country's forces just a little bit closer to a nuclear power plant that Russia is mistreating to the point where it could create a nuclear catastrophe. Ukraine can't allow that to happen. That's why its assault groups will likely start working even harder in Zaporizhia in the coming months. Ukraine's new strategy is working elsewhere, including in Dobropilya and Donetsk. But it may just be in Zaporizhia where Ukraine has to push the hardest to stop Russia from making one stupid mistake too many with a nuclear power plant. Russia isn't merely struggling on land and in the air at the moment as it persists with its wasteful, unsustainable invasion of Ukraine. It's also having a hard time at sea. In fact, according to recent reports from NATO officials, the Russian Navy is experiencing a serious crisis, as evidenced by its humiliating retreat from the waters of the Mediterranean. NATO officials have naturally been keeping a close eye on Russian military movements of late, especially in the wake of recent drone incursions into NATO airspace in countries like Poland and Romania. Member nations need to be one step ahead of Russia at a time when so many world leaders are currently fearful of further Kremlin aggression or even a direct attack on a NATO nation like one of the Baltic states. As such, the alliance is keen to keep tabs on the Kremlin, monitoring its various assets not only in Ukraine but elsewhere. They've been tracking Russian naval assets in the Mediterranean Sea for some time, and one NATO representative recently revealed the shocking truth: Russia barely has any ships left in this particular body of water. The official, who has preferred to remain anonymous while speaking to the media, stated, "It's our assessment that the Russian Navy, which is already resource-constrained regarding where to place its assets, is experiencing force-generation challenges and dilemmas currently affecting its posture in the Mediterranean Sea." In other words, Russia is experiencing such serious problems of late, with so many of its assets either damaged, destroyed, or occupied elsewhere, it simply can't afford to maintain any sort of sizable force in the biggest sea in Europe. This is a dramatic shift. Russia has, throughout its history, strived to maintain a strong naval presence in the Mediterranean, officially known as the Permanent Task Force of the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean Sea. Even if we go back to the days of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Navy also made it a priority to have a fleet in the Mediterranean too, officially known as the 5th Operational Squadron. This shows how important the area is in the eyes of the country's leadership, both now and in the past, and it's not hard to understand why. The Mediterranean is not only the largest sea in Europe, but also one of the most significant bodies of water in the world. It's been a major center of trade and travel throughout the ages, serving as a strategic link between 3 separate continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And there are over 20 countries that border the waters of the Mediterranean, including European nations like France, Italy, and Greece, Asian nations such as Turkey and Syria, and African countries like Egypt and Algeria. It stands to reason that Russia would want some sort of presence in that part of the world in order to project its power and influence into the region. And the Mediterranean was a notable Cold War theater, with the Soviets' 5th Operational Squadron serving as a foil for the US Navy's 6th Fleet, which controlled large parts of the sea at the time. Times have changed since then. The Soviet Union is no more and the Cold War has come to an end, but Russia has continued to operate vessels in the area, setting up its permanent task force in the Mediterranean Sea in 2013. This allows the Kremlin to maintain some sort of pressure towards NATO's southern flank, rather than effectively allowing the US and Europe to almost entirely control the area. It also gives Russia the opportunity to keep a close eye on movements and trade routes across the water, along with the possibility to intervene and disrupt those routes should it feel the need to do so, plus the ability to support any allies it may have in the region. In 2015, for example, Russia used ships in the Mediterranean as part of its intervention in the Syrian civil war, with the Kremlin lending its military support to the Syrian president at the time, Bashar al-Assad. When it was first formed, Russia's Mediterranean Task Force was made up of a mixture of vessels from the Black Sea Fleet and Northern Fleet, and it was stationed in Syria. It has historically been comprised of up to 15 warships, along with auxiliary vessels, and additional ships from the Baltic Fleet can be provided on demand should the task force need to carry out operations in the area. We've also seen Moscow operate multiple submarines in the Mediterranean in the past to strengthen its position and enhance its operational capabilities in the region. But that once mighty naval force appears to be no more, with Russia now operating just a few ships in the region at any given time. According to the NATO official who revealed the news, there are two main reasons behind the decline of Russia's Mediterranean naval force. The first and perhaps most significant reason is the loss of Russia's strategic port in the Syrian city of Tartus. This all stems back to the aforementioned Syrian civil war, in which Russia tried but ultimately failed to keep Bashar al-Assad in power and crush opposition offensives. The Kremlin held a lot of power in Syria for many years, but with the fall of the Assad regime in late 2024, its influence was effectively wiped out in one fell swoop. Indeed, only days after the regime was toppled, a report emerged from Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, GUR, revealing that Russia had initiated a mass evacuation of both troops and military equipment from the two bases it held in the country, Latakia, which was the main Russian airbase in Syria, and Tartus, its naval base. Russia had relied heavily on Tartus for decades as its main refueling, docking, and maintenance location in the Mediterranean Sea, having first moved ships into the area in the early 1970s after a Soviet-Syrian lease agreement was signed. We saw exactly how important this base was during the war in Syria, when it was used for delivering weapons from Russia to the Assad regime. In 2015, Moscow and Damascus signed a brand new 49-year lease agreement, and Russia invested heavily in infrastructure, building up its presence in Tartus and stationing additional personnel and equipment at the site. Tartus has also been nicknamed Russia's window into Africa, providing a launch pad for the Kremlin to extend its tendrils of influence across the African continent. It was used, for example, for the deployment of Wagner Group mercenaries to various African nations, playing a massive role in Russia's mission to expand its geopolitical reach in countries like Cameroon, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, to name but a few. Having Tartus under Russian control was a win-win for both al-Assad and for Russia's President Vladimir Putin. But with al-Assad out of power, and now being said to be living a luxurious life in Moscow, Russia suddenly faced a harsh new reality. In January of this year, the new Syrian government effectively tore up the lease agreement between the two nations, officially kicking the Russians out of the area. In the days and weeks that followed, Russia was forced to evacuate its flotilla into the Mediterranean, sending additional support vessels like the cargo ship Sparta II and the landing ship Alexander Shabalin, among others, to the area to assist with the evacuation. Russian frigates that had called Tartus home for years, like the Admiral Gorshakov and Admiral Golovko, left the port for the last time, and despite its best efforts to negotiate an extended stay in the region, the Kremlin lost access to its only Mediterranean naval base for refueling, repairing, and resupplying its local task force. The impact of that loss cannot be overstated. With Tartus, Russia had a base that it could turn to and rely on in the Mediterranean Sea. That made it much easier to maintain a sizable fleet in the region, as the various vessels involved always had somewhere to go and dock when needed. Troops and supplies could be loaded on and off the ships in Syria, and if Russia needed to take action at any time in the region, it had a force that was ready to be refueled and rolled out onto the water. Now, it has no such option. Instead, if Russia wants to continue operating vessels in the Mediterranean, it will have to deploy them from its other ports and naval bases, none of which are actually within the Mediterranean region. Indeed, the closest options Russia has right now are its Black Sea ports, including one in the Russian city of Novorossiysk and others in the occupied region of Crimea. Even then, it's not exactly easy for Russia to get ships from the Black Sea down into the Mediterranean, as they would have to travel long distances, using huge amounts of fuel in the process, and transit through Turkish-controlled straits. That would be problematic at the best of times, but it's an even bigger issue at the moment, as Russia is currently suffering through a serious and ever-worsening fuel crisis, brought about in large part by Ukraine's recent series of drone attacks on oil refineries, pipelines, and other fuel-related infrastructure across the country. The country barely has enough fuel to keep its war machine chugging along, so would certainly struggle to find excess stocks to power its naval vessels on their long journeys to the Mediterranean. The Kremlin could also make use of some of its other northern or Baltic ports, like the Baltiysk port, situated within the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea coast. However, ships leaving that location would have to travel even longer and more complicated routes to reach the Mediterranean. Even if the vessels made it that far, they'd have to stick to a tight schedule, ensuring that they begin the return journey in good time so that they don't run out of fuel or supplies before making it back to port. In short, losing control of Tartus has made it almost impossible for Russia's Mediterranean Sea task force to continue existing. As the NATO official puts it, with the loss of that port now, for example, if they bring a Kilo-class submarine into the area, they'll have to bring it all the way down there from one of their northern or Baltic ports. Being able to sustain operations is definitely more challenging. We saw evidence of this only weeks ago in late September when the Russian submarine, codenamed Novorossiysk, was forced to surface near the Strait of Gibraltar. The 250-foot or 74-meter Kilo-class sub was on combat duty in the Mediterranean but experienced some sort of technical failure. Fuel began leaking into the bilge at the bottom of the vessel's hull, and according to reports shared on social media channels like Telegram, the submarine did not have the necessary spare parts or even the relevant specialists on board to fix the issue. As such, it was forced to surface, and it was later spotted making the long trek back to the Baltic Sea to be repaired. This is a whole new level of challenge for the Russian Navy to handle. While it is still possible for them to get vessels, like the submarine, down to the Mediterranean, the absence of any official base or even a friendly port in the area means that every trip is far riskier than before, because if something goes wrong, help is a long, long way away. The second big reason why Russia appears to have reduced the size and scale of its Mediterranean fleet is because it now seems to be shifting its focus to the Baltic Sea, where NATO has been building a large-scale force of its own. In January, shortly after undersea cables in the Baltic were damaged, potentially by Russia, the alliance launched the Baltic Sentry mission, aimed at enhancing the protection of critical underwater infrastructure and improving allies' ability to respond to any acts or threats of destabilization in the Baltic region. Announcing the initiative, NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte said, "By working together with all allies, we will do what it takes to ensure the safety and security not only of our critical infrastructure, but of all that we hold dear." This mission has involved the deployment of NATO frigates, patrol aircraft, drones, and national monitoring assets, strengthening the alliance's posture in the region while simultaneously putting pressure on Russia's Baltic fleet. In response, the Kremlin appears to have redirected and repositioned many of its naval assets to this area, attempting to build up a force that might counter NATO's expansion and protect Russian interests and shipping routes. But the sad fact of the matter for Russia is that its best efforts simply aren't good enough. While the Kremlin does not release official data regarding how many ships make up its Baltic fleet, an open-source report that was published earlier this year by the International Institute for Strategic Studies found that it includes around 69 vessels in total. Compared to the full might of the naval forces that NATO members can deploy, that's not a big number. And it gets worse for Russia, as many of the 69 vessels making up the Baltic fleet are said to be on the older and smaller side. In other words, this isn't a fleet of high-end, state-of-the-art warships, destroyers, and submarines. Instead, it's largely comprised of vessels that wouldn't stand much chance at all in any kind of confrontation with NATO forces. And this was confirmed by a former Belgian Navy officer named Frederik van Lokeren. Writing for the online news portal Naval News, van Lokeren looked at how the Russian Navy had suffered in recent years at the hands of Ukrainian drones and missiles, writing, "The Russian Navy, and more specifically its Baltic Sea fleet, has been on the receiving end of a targeted Ukrainian naval campaign that saw the use of unmanned surface vessels and cruise missiles. As a result of this naval campaign, several vessels of Russia's Black Sea fleet were damaged and destroyed, and the fleet itself was forced to abandon its bases in Crimea and withdrew to the naval base of Novorossiysk in southern Russia." The former officer went on to analyze Russia's recent naval training exercises and attempts to better protect its naval assets, but came to one clear conclusion about Russia's naval prospects in comparison to NATO's. Within the Baltic Sea, the Russian Baltic fleet is severely outnumbered compared to the available NATO forces of the Baltic Sea nations. The Baltic fleet also largely operates from Kaliningrad, which is an exposed location, surrounded and isolated by neighboring countries which are part of NATO. It is not expected that in the current situation, the Baltic fleet will be able to put up much resistance given the overwhelming directly available NATO forces within the Baltic region. Van Lokeren says that Russia could potentially give its navy a fighting chance against NATO by investing in the development of unmanned surface vessels, otherwise known as marine drones. But he also notes that NATO already has a bit of a head start in this area thanks to Ukraine. NATO forces will undoubtedly also have studied Ukrainians' USV campaign in the Black Sea and probably have direct access to data and knowledge from Ukraine itself. NATO is gaining more valuable experience in drone warfare all the time. Its forces are learning from engagements with Houthi rebels in the Red Sea, for example, and uncovering new strategies and tactics to both utilize maritime drones offensively and defend against them. We've already seen numerous NATO warships deploying additional light and heavy machine guns along their outer decks, for example, to more effectively neutralize incoming swarms. The anonymous NATO official agrees with Van Lokkeren's assessment, stating, "I do think allies have a technological advantage over Russia when it comes to readied and effective naval drones, but we can't let off the gas, and they, allied nations, must maintain a sense of urgency as we seek to maintain and increase our edge with innovation." In other words, as long as NATO keeps up the hard work, continues to learn valuable lessons from the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and maintains its commitment to initiatives like Baltic Sentry, there's very little that the Russian Navy can do against it. It certainly doesn't have the necessary number of vessels to assert dominance in regions like the Baltic Sea, nor does it have the infrastructure needed to project power in areas like the Mediterranean Sea. Instead, the Kremlin's naval forces find themselves in an utterly humiliating position, forced out of the Tartar space they relied on for so many years, and without any other home to turn to in the Mediterranean region. Their numbers are dwindling too, thanks to Ukraine's many successful drone and missile strikes over the course of the war so far. Kyiv taking out submarines, landing ships, frigates, corvettes, and other vessels. And with Ukraine getting stronger all the time, strengthening its drone army and expanding its missile strike capabilities, there's no telling how much more the Russian Navy may suffer at the hands of its enemies in the weeks and months to come. We could see the likes of long Neptune missile strikes on more Russian ports, for example, or maritime drone attacks on Kilo-class submarines and Baltic Fleet frigates. In summary, the Russian Navy is in a terrible situation, and there are zero signs of it getting any better anytime soon.
It was intended to be one of Russia's most effective weapons, a stealth missile fired from Russia's supposed fifth-generation fighter jet, the Su-57, that could evade air defenses and strike a target with immense force. Powerful, hidden, seemingly unstoppable. For Vladimir Putin, this missile was supposed to represent one of the greatest threats that Russia could pose to Ukraine's cities. And now, one of those missiles is a flaming piece of junk. Ukraine took out one of Russia's stealthiest missiles, and it did it with a weapon that was never designed to counter missiles. And Putin rages as Ukraine strikes his stealth missile using cheap tech. On October 11, United 24 media reported on Ukraine's amazing missile kill shot, noting that Ukraine has managed to take down a Kh-69 missile, which is believed to be among the stealthiest missiles that Russia has in its arsenal, using an APKWS interceptor. The interceptor will be explored in more detail later in the video. For now, the key point is that the APKWS is a laser-guided rocket capable of destroying aerial targets. Laser guidance makes APKWS ideal for destroying slow-moving drones. Ukraine just used the system to take out one of Russia's best missiles. Best of all, Ukraine achieved this remarkable feat using a rocket that costs far less than the missile that it destroyed. Each Kh-69 cost Russia around $500,000 to build, Euromaidan Press reported in September. The rocket Ukraine used cost a fraction of the price, just $25,000, according to United 24 media. That means Ukraine just achieved a 20-to-1 return, all using a rocket that should never have been able to come close to a Kh-69 in full flight. Russia might want to deny this ever happened, but it can't. Ukraine has footage of the entire incident. Published as a Facebook reel by Ukraine's Air Command East, the video shows what happened to Russia's missile as seen from the perspective of the weapon system Ukraine used to fire the APKWS. The missile is seen hurtling through the sky, with the APKWS locked on and tracking it in flight. Observant viewers will even see the laser pointer the APKWS uses flashing on the Russian missile. Just as the Kh-69 looks like it's about to start its defense, the trigger is pulled and Ukraine's rocket is fired. The result is clear for anybody to see. The Kh-69 gets blown to pieces by a $25,000 rocket. The footage soon found its way into the hands of the OSINT Technical X account. OSINT stands for Open Source Intelligence, with OSINT Technical often providing breakdowns of footage and interesting statistics relating to the Ukraine war. It has the following to say about Ukraine's footage. Footage of a Ukrainian vampire brawler SAM system shooting down a Russian Kh-69 cruise missile with a low-cost APKWS laser-guided rocket. The outlet adds that this footage confirms that the platform, initially intended as an anti-drone weapon, can also successfully down higher-end threats. That's why Putin is fuming. Russia can lose as many drones as Ukraine can shoot out of the skies. Russia can always build more because those drones are cheap and expendable. but a $500,000 missile represents an investment in the destruction of a Ukrainian city. If Ukraine can shoot those missiles out of the sky with a rocket that costs a fraction of the price, Putin knows that the West only has to hand over more of these laser-guided rockets to make Russia's Kh-69s far less effective. OSINT mentioned something interesting, noting that Ukraine used one of its Brawler surface-to-air missile or SAM systems to fire the APKWS. It's unclear how much this particular system costs, but it also doesn't really matter. Ukraine can use one Brawler over and over again. Each Kh-69, along with the APKWS Ukraine used to shoot that missile down, is a one-time only weapon. It's meant to launch, travel and destroy, not launch, travel and be destroyed. Ukraine pulled off its amazing feat during yet another night when Russia launched a heavy aerial strike. Militani has the details of Russia's strike, noting that it took place on October 10 and that it saw Russia launch huge numbers of drones along with cruise and ballistic missiles at Ukraine. It appears Russia was attempting to take out Ukrainian energy infrastructure during this attack, and it was somewhat successful. Russia's missiles and drones managed to damage some infrastructure, in addition to damaging residential buildings. Kyiv was hit. Some areas of Ukraine's capital were left without electricity. Particular targets included the Pechersky district, where Russian drone debris struck several residential buildings, causing fires. The Podilsky and Desnyansky districts also experienced drone debris issues as the remnants of Russian Shahed types fell near an open space and a clinic respectively. Infrastructure facilities were also attacked in Zaporizhia during Russia's aerial nighttime raid, with repeated shelling leading to the death of a 7-year-old boy. Back in Kyiv, Russia's aerial onslaught injured at least 12 people, 8 of whom had to go to the hospital. Russia managed to cause a lot of damage on October 10. It would have caused a lot more if Ukraine hadn't managed to shoot one of its Kh-69s down using a cheap laser-guided rocket. And that leads nicely to a closer examination of the weapon that Ukraine used and the one that it took out. The focus first turns to the APKWS, which is an interesting piece of kit. United 24 Media says that the weapon was developed by BAE Systems, which is a world leader in aerospace technology that's based in the UK. But the program is a US Department of Defense program, so APKWS isn't a Ukrainian weapon. It's a Western rocket that Ukraine has proven is far more useful than anybody in the West, along with Putin, could have ever expected. The APKWS is interesting because it's a conversion kit rather than a standalone rocket. United 24 Media says that each of these kits converts a 70mm Hydra rocket into a precision-guided munition by adding the laser seeker mentioned earlier. This seeker uses semi-active laser guidance, SAL, which may be the key behind why Ukraine was able to use it to track and take out a Russian stealth missile, and Ukraine has been using APKWS since 2023. In many ways, the APKWS is similar to the glide rocket kits that Russia has used to such devastating effect against Ukraine. Those kits convert dumb bombs, typically Russia's massive stockpile of Soviet-era fab bombs, into weapons that can travel further thanks to a pair of fold-out wings and a primitive guidance system. APKWS does something similar on the defensive end for Ukraine's rockets, only it converts those rockets into something more precise than Russia's glide bombs could ever hope to be. Naval Air Systems Command provides some more details, noting that the APKWS guidance system is about 18.5 inches long. Added onto a rocket, that guidance system makes the entire weapon almost 74 inches long. A typical APKWS weighs about 32 pounds, with the guidance system accounting for around 9 to 10 pounds of that weight. The rocket Ukraine used is also pretty fast. It hits a top speed of about 1 kilometer per second, which is roughly equivalent to 2,236 miles per hour. That's almost Mach 3, which may explain why Ukraine's $25,000 rocket was able to hit a Kh-69. As for the APKWS warhead, it's loaded with 10 pounds of explosive thanks to its use of legacy Hydra rockets. Plus, based on all of the information from Naval Air Systems Command, the UK has been more than happy to share this weapon with its Western partners. The US clearly deploys it, and now Ukraine has a steady supply of APKWS kits too. This isn't a new concept either. BAE Systems' own product page notes that APKWS has been combat proven for over 10 years, and that its main advantage is hitting a target with pinpoint accuracy while keeping collateral damage to a minimum. In the KH-69's case, that means the APKWS blew the rocket to pieces with any collateral damage occurring due to debris from that rocket falling onto the ground. As BAE Systems puts it, the APKWS system bridges the gap between unguided rockets and larger anti-armor munitions, with commonality across the US military services, Navy, Marine Corps, Army and Air Force. The APKWS system consistently delivers pinpoint accuracy for the highest lethality available against soft and lightly armored targets at a lower cost than other systems. That bridging of the gap is what's worked in Ukraine's favor. A standard rocket would never have been able to take out a KH-69, barring a 1 in a million shot that would have required luck over accuracy. As for the larger anti-armor munitions BAE mentions, Ukraine has a very limited supply of those, and they're much more expensive than the APKWS. Ukraine does use these types of systems, with the US-made Patriot perhaps being the most famous example. But if it can achieve the same results using a $25,000 rocket instead of an air defense missile that costs many times more, then those heavier systems can be reversed for even worse threats than those Russia unleashed on October 10. The APKWS is hardly some ancient weapon. It's actually a very clever piece of kit that Ukraine has used to great effect for years, though never quite in the way that it was used on October 10. It's a weapon system that's perfect for dealing with drones and stationary threats, which is what makes it all the more impressive that Ukraine just destroyed one of Russia's premier missiles using a rocket and one of these kits. How impressive? Well, just explore the KH-69 specifications to find the answer to that question. Militani provides the basics in its report on Ukraine's remarkable feat. It says that the KH-69 was unveiled back in 2009, though it was called the KH-59 Mk2 at the time. It's made by Russia's Raduga State Machine Building Design Bureau, and it was redesigned almost from the ground up in 2015 to incorporate the sort of stealth elements that should have made it impossible for Ukraine to shoot down using an APKWS. The only thing left after this redesign was the missile's guidance system, with even the body of the missile undergoing an overhaul to ensure the missile was compatible with Russia's new Su-57 fighter jets. Beyond those jets, Russia can launch KH-69s from its Su-30MK, Su-34, Su-35, MiG-29K and MiG-35S aerial platforms. Russia says that the missile carries a warhead weighing about 683 pounds, which is substantially more than the 10-pound warhead used by the rocket that took the KH-69 out on October 10. Then again, a rocket doesn't have to do much work with a missile packing such a heavy warhead. As long as the rocket can penetrate and explode, the missile's warhead does the rest. Militani adds that the KH-69 travels at up to 622 miles per hour, which is a lot slower than the APKWS, and it has a reported range of roughly 180 to 250 miles. So this is a long-range missile that is fast, though not as fast as the rocket that destroyed it. And with such a massive warhead, it would surely have caused a lot of damage if Ukraine had allowed it to hit its target. Then there's the aspect of the KH-69 that was supposed to make it almost impossible to hit: its stealth capabilities. Army Recognition reports that the KH-69 incorporates wave-absorbing materials in its structure. These materials are supposed to reduce the missile's radar cross-section, making it very difficult to detect and intercept by air defense systems. That small radar cross-section should also come in handy during Russia's massive aerial strikes, as it may make the missile difficult to distinguish from the hordes of drones that Russia sends into Ukraine. Perhaps that's how Ukraine's APKWS was able to find the missile. Maybe it seemed like a drone on radar, only for Ukraine to discover a missile once it locked on. Russia is certainly proud enough of the missile. In February 2024, Bulgarian military referred to the KH-69 as a stealth stunner that was eluding Western intelligence. Putin would have loved to have read that report. Finally, Russia had a missile that Western air defense systems would really struggle to take down. The outlet adds that the missile is also supposed to be stealthier than many of its Western counterparts. The creators of the KH-69 proudly present it as one of Russia's most precise cruise missiles, boasting an impressive error margin of merely 3 meters, Bulgarian military writes. further accentuating its competitive edge. The missile's distinctive shape and unique materials result in a dispersion area surpassing its Western counterparts, including the Franco-British Scalp EG Storm Shadow, the US AGM-158 JASSM, and Germany's Taurus. A competitive edge the Kh-69 may have. But that didn't stop Ukraine from blowing Russia's stealth stunner out of the sky with a $25,000 rocket. Putin will already be fuming about that, as Russia has just been humiliated in a way that he would never have expected when the Kh-69 was unleashed. However, he'll be absolutely livid over the fact that this isn't the first time Russia has been left with egg on its collective face when it comes to its advanced stealth missile. In fact, it's not even the first time during the last couple of weeks. As impressive as Ukraine destroying a Kh-69 with an APKWS may have been, even that feat lands squarely in the shadow of what it pulled off on September 19. Ukraine has also managed to take out a Kh-69 with a World War I era machine gun and just $11 of ammo. Find out more about that in our video covering what happened, but the message from all of this is clear. Russia's most impressive stealth missile may not be as fantastic as Putin would like the world to believe. And even if it does live up to the hype on the stealth front, it's a very bad look for Russia that systems that aren't supposed to be able to take out a Kh-69 are doing just that. The question now is, what does this mean for the future of Ukraine's defense against Russia's Kh-69s? As impressive as shooting one of Russia's stealth missiles down with an APKWS may have been, it can't be assumed that this sort of thing is going to become standard practice for Ukraine going forward. It's good to know that a $25,000 rocket can destroy a Kh-69, assuming the operators behind the system that fires that rocket can spot the Russian missile in flight. However, that's far from guaranteed. So, Ukraine is unlikely to replace its other air defense systems with APKWS rockets anytime soon. Still, it's always nice for Ukraine to have another air defense trick up its sleeve, and Ukraine needs as many of those tricks as it can get, as Russia's missile and drone strikes have only been growing more intense as 2025 has progressed. The week leading up to the Kh-69 being shot down was especially painful for Ukraine. Beyond the strike mentioned earlier in the video, Russia launched thousands of aerial projectiles at Ukraine during the first week or so of October. That's according to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who Al Jazeera reports as saying that Russia launched more than 3,100 drones, 92 missiles, and around 1,360 glide bombs. That amounts to 4,500 projectiles in a single week. So anything that Ukraine has that's capable of taking out the most powerful of those projectiles is a massive boon. Defense Blog says the same thing, noting, the system's effectiveness against a stealth profile missile like the Kh-69 would demonstrate an important new capability for Ukrainian air defenses, showing how adaptable Western supplied systems can be when integrated into Ukraine's layered defense network. It's the new capability that Ukraine will be happiest about, and that will make Putin all the more furious. It's been said before, the APKWS isn't supposed to be able to do what it did on October 10. Now that Ukraine knows that it can, it might start trying to use these rockets to down more of Russia's missiles. The APKWS isn't going to replace what Ukraine already has, as mentioned. But who knows? With the rise of interceptor drones that are capable of taking down Russian Shahed-type unmanned aerial vehicles, perhaps a few more APKWS could be assigned to missile duty in the future. And there's another aspect to what Ukraine just pulled off that might go underreported. The Kh-69 isn't just a missile made by Russia for use in Ukraine, it's a missile that Russia intends to sell. In fact, Russia is already trying to do just that. On June 21, Defense.in reported that Russia was offering its Kh-69 stealth missiles to India for use in the latter's Su-30s. Those missiles would complement the Indian Air Force's Scalp stockpiles, the outlet says. And it notes that Russia is trying to strengthen the long-standing weapons sales relationship that it has with India. That's a relationship that certainly requires some strengthening. Over the last couple of decades, India's reliance on Russia's weapons has been decreasing. That's according to the Center for Countering Disinformation, which said in December 2024 that India got 76% of its weapons imports from Russia in 2009. By 2023, that percentage was down to 36%, representing a clear trend away from Russia's weapons for India. Perhaps Russia had hoped that its offer of Kh-69 missiles to India would help to reverse that trend. Now, the question has to be asked, will India even be interested in a supposed stealth missile that can be taken out by a $25,000 rocket? It can be assumed that the $500,000 price tag for the Kh-69 that was mentioned earlier is Russia's manufacturing cost, rather than what it would see the missile for. A markup is likely, and India will need to buy dozens of these missiles to ensure a decent stockpile. Is it going to take that risk now that it can see what's happening to the Kh-69 in Ukraine? Perhaps. Or perhaps not. And if India does decide to avoid the Kh-69, then what happened on October 10 may have had an unintended and positive side effect for Ukraine. The country was just trying to defend itself against yet another Russian aerial strike. But more Kh-69 humiliation may end up making the missile a very hard sell for Russia, which in turn damages a weapons industry that's already started to struggle once the Ukraine war started. Vladimir Putin thought he had the perfect strategy for the Ukraine war. At least, he had the perfect strategy after his initial attempt to seize Ukraine within a week utterly failed. All Russia needed to do was wear Ukraine down through sheer numbers. Eventually, the defense would collapse and Russia could take Ukraine quickly afterward. That was over 3 years ago. Russia has made minimal territorial gains since then, especially when weighed against its significant losses. Now, Putin is dealing with a war that's lasted longer than it should and has served as a catalogue of his inability to deliver on his promises. Putin's massive failures in the Ukraine war are tearing Russia apart, and the future looks bleak for Putin's country. John Foreman sums it up easily in an October 10 interview with Times Radio. Foreman, who served as the UK's defence attaché to Moscow and Kyiv between 2019 and 2022, understands Putin better than most outside of Russia, and he has a clear opinion on how Putin has failed in Ukraine. When asked about how Russia's recent hybrid warfare strikes in Europe are linked to the Ukraine battlefield, Foreman says bluntly,
"Yes, I think Russia has experienced a strategic catastrophe by invading Ukraine."
Putin's biggest failure, Foreman says, is that Russia simply hasn't taken the amount of territory that it should have. 2025 in particular has been a bad one for Putin. As Foreman says of Russia,
its entire year's advance has been tiny, and it seems to be winding down now and resetting for 2026.
Foreman isn't wrong. Russia started the year by making some of its smallest territorial advances at any point during the Ukraine war. By April, a clear slowdown was emerging, as Al Jazeera reported at the time. It highlighted figures published by both the UK Ministry of Defence and the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. Both organisations offered slightly different outlooks on Russia's advances, though they both concluded that they were slow. The Ministry of Defence said that Russia had managed to claim just 126 square miles of Ukraine in January. By February, that number was down to 76 square miles, and it went down again to 55 square miles in March. According to the ISW, Russia's gains were a little better, but by no means impressive. January saw Russia claim 165 square miles of Ukraine, the ISW said, followed by 137 square miles in February and 78 square miles in March. In both cases, there's a clear downward trend. But Putin at least had big plans for the summer. He organised a massive summer offensive with the goals of creating a buffer zone in Sumy and finally taking the key logistical city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. Putin dedicated almost thousands upon thousands of troops to these goals, only to see Russia's military utterly fail to achieve them. Yes, Russia gained more Ukrainian territory in the summer than it did in the early winter and spring, but it didn't gain the territory it wanted, nor the territory that it needed to make more substantial gains later on. Now, as Foreman points out, Russia is on the downswing again. On October 1st, CNN reported on claims by the Deep State Monitoring Group that Russia had managed to capture just 100 square miles of Ukraine in September. That's right back down to the sort of numbers that we saw at the beginning of 2025, and it's indicative of yet another blunder by Putin. Worse yet, says Deep State, these types of numbers showcase just how badly Putin's Ukraine war is really going. Last month, the enemy occupied 44% less territory than in August, Deep State claims. Over the course of the month, the Russians managed to occupy 0.04% of the country's total area, bringing the total figure to 19.04%. Of course, Russia is trying to put as positive a spin on all of this as possible. When the Deep State report came out, Russia was claiming that it had managed to take about 5,000 square kilometers, or about 1,930 square miles of land in Ukraine this year. Even that, as inflated as the number appears to be, is hardly impressive for Russia. As the Kyiv Post reported on October 8, Russia surpassed the million casualties mark during the summer, and it's lost 281,000 soldiers and counting in 2025. And that's without even covering that Ukraine has been on a tear of retaking territory since the end of the summer. These are massive failures in anybody's book other than Putin's. And perhaps the biggest failure of Russia's leader is that he shows no sign of changing course. Peace certainly isn't on Putin's agenda, as Foreman told Times Radio.
I think Putin's overall political intent remains the same, to bring Ukraine to heel, and we have the chances of peace have become more remote.
That will lead to Putin also ramping up Russia's hybrid and cyber threats against Europe, which could yet be another mistake that ends up hurting Russia than helping it. That point will be addressed in a moment. First, Foreman seems to be right on the money when it comes to Putin's refusal to accept peace, which in turn consigns Russia to yet more months or even years of a war, which has already cost it dear. Almost everybody who's in some way a stakeholder in the Ukraine war believes that Putin doesn't intend to declare peace. The European Union's or EU's Kaja Kallas said as much in the wake of Putin's groundbreaking visit to meet US President Donald Trump in Alaska back in August. But the harsh reality is that Russia has no intention of ending this war anytime soon, Kallas wrote on X on August 16. Even as delegations met, Russia launched new attacks on Ukraine. Putin continues to drag out negotiations, and he hopes to get away with it. He left Anchorage without making any commitments to end the killing. The Atlantic Council has a similarly grim view of Putin's lack of desire for peace, noting that, despite Trump's efforts, Putin has time and time again tried to stall peace. Records for the sheer size and scale of Russia's drone assaults on Ukraine are being sent as Putin talks about peace. The outlet concludes that Putin has made it as clear as day that he has no interest in ending the Ukraine war, even as thousands of Russia's people die. Putin's approach to peace is yet another of his massive failures, a point that will be explained later in the video. A complete inability to back down from his maximalist demands, which include Ukraine ceding vast tracts of territory to Russia and then neutering itself to the point where it could be invaded again with far less resistance, lies at the heart of these demands. Putin also now sees the military-industrial complex he's created in Russia as his country's main economic driver, says the Peace Research Institute Oslo, and so ending the war is the exact opposite of what Russia's leader wants to do. Putin has backed Russia into a corner from which there's no escape, and there are hints that even people inside Russia are starting to see the Ukraine war as a hopeless endeavor. Coming back to the Alaska peace talks for a moment, Foreman says that some inside Russia believe that they ended up being worse for Russia than anybody might have thought. While Foreman downplays the idea that those talks were a disaster for Putin, he did tell Times Radio,
I just call it a complete waste of time and effort. Trump trying to Hail Mary a peace deal without any preparation at the last minute was never going to work. That's not the Russian approach. I think the Russian wording now is it's a waste of time. Didn't lead anywhere.
That's in stark contrast to how Russia's political elite felt following the Alaska meeting. On August 16, Reuters reported that Russian politicians were hailing the Alaska meeting as a triumph for Russia that would take the country a step closer to achieving the version of peace that it wants. One of those people was Andrei Klishus, who the outlet says is the senior lawmaker for the United Russia Party that Putin helms. The meeting in Alaska confirmed Russia's desire for peace, long-term and fair, Klishus said. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the upper house of the Kremlin, Konstantin Kosachev, was also happy. The very fact of the meeting in Alaska, its tone and its outcome represent a significant and joint success for both presidents, each of whom made a tremendous personal contribution to achieving the best possible result at this time. So what's changed since August? It's possible that these types of comments were just examples of Russian politicians licking the boots of their leader to curry favor. However, Putin often uses those who support him as mouthpieces, so it's perhaps more likely that these kinds of messages were intended for Trump. Putin wants to convince Trump that he'd done a good job and was moving the war closer to a peace settlement, all as Russia continued to bomb Ukraine as it always had. Putin thought he had Trump figured out. He didn't. That's yet another strategic failure on Putin's part that's caused serious damage to Russia, and it may be why the waste of time opinion is now becoming prevalent, per Foreman's claims. So, Putin is having to try different things to distract from his many Ukraine failures, which leads back to the point mentioned earlier: Russia's cyber and hybrid warfare attacks against Europe during the last few months. The Atlantic Council outlined some of these attacks in an October 9 piece, in which it labels Putin as a geopolitical gangster who's trying to intimidate Europe. A wave of Russian drones flew into Poland at the beginning of September. Russian fighter jets entered Estonian airspace a few days later. There have also been Russian drone sightings in countries like Germany, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands, all of which are EU and NATO nations that express immense support for Ukraine. These are the types of attacks that Foreman is talking about, and they appear to become a key part of Putin's Ukraine war strategy. Russia's leader is trying to use hybrid warfare to stop Ukraine's allies from offering support. Plus, as Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky noted on October 12, Putin is also trying to take Western eyes off the Ukraine war. Russia is now taking advantage of the moment, the fact that the Middle East and domestic issues in every country are getting maximum attention, Zelensky wrote on X. He's not wrong. Foreman also told Times Radio what Russia's plan for Europe is likely to be going forward.
I do see, the ramping up of these threats, whether it's cyber, whether it's espionage, whether it's sabotage, whether it's incursions, whether it's at sea or not. The evidence is out. Is part of that to ultimately to stop us supporting Ukraine.
Herein lies what may end up being another of Putin's strategic failures. Putin's goal is to make Ukraine's European allies so wary of Russia that they stop supporting Ukraine, keep them focused on themselves, and Ukraine will grow weaker. However, Putin simply steeled the collective resolve of NATO's European members. They're now considering military responses against Russia's hybrid warfare threats, as discussed in a video earlier in October. Check out that video to learn more. But even more than uniting NATO and the EU against him, Putin is doing exactly what he's trying to make the rest of Europe do with Russia's cyber and hybrid attacks: taking eyes off the Ukraine war. Dividing his country's military attention between Ukraine and Europe means that Putin isn't thinking about how to fix the many strategic mistakes he's made during the war. Perhaps Putin is so egocentric that he believes he's made no mistakes at all. Or he might have surrounded himself with so many yes men that he has no idea that Russia's territorial gains are nowhere near as impressive as he tries to make them sound when he talks about them. Whatever the case may be, the focus on Europe may be Putin's biggest mistake of all. Ukraine is a far more significant problem for Russia, and Putin seems incapable of changing an approach to the Ukraine war that's been slowly killing Russia for over 3 years. And that leads to how all of this is tearing Russia apart. That's happening even if Putin doesn't see it, and it starts with Russia's geopolitical status. Thanks to Putin's actions after Alaska, the pandering to Trump that Russia thought that would keep the US at least partially on Russia's side is now failing. Any support Russia had from the US since Trump became president is gone, and Trump is openly talking about offering more support to Ukraine than he has at any other point since he took office. Trump has said that he believes Ukraine has the ability to retake the territory that it's lost to Russia, which is a complete turnaround from his earlier assertions that Ukraine holds no cards. The Lowy Institute even believes that Trump may be right, noting that Russia is bleeding soldiers on the battlefield and is also dealing with Ukrainian strikes against energy infrastructure that are hurting the country economically. The Associated Press adds that Trump now claims that he's considering sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Those missiles can travel for around 1,500 miles, which would put all relevant parts of Russia in Ukraine's crosshairs, assuming that Trump follows through. That's a big assumption, of course. Trump may just be talking to demonstrate to Putin what might happen if Russia's leader doesn't play ball. But even if that's the case, the change in US rhetoric is a startling showcase of just how badly Putin has failed to play the US at a game that he thought he was winning. The topic of Ukraine's energy infrastructure strikes was mentioned a moment ago. Those have been extensive. On October 5, The Economist reported that Ukraine had hit around half of Russia's major oil refineries in August and September alone. noting that as much as 40% of Russia's refining capacity has been taken offline. Gasoline exports are lower, the same goes for diesel, and in many Russian regions, gasoline shortages are forcing queues at the pumps and restrictions on how much gasoline a customer can buy. Those refinery attacks may also be carried out with US help, which is yet another shot at Putin's belief that he had played Trump like a fiddle. On October 12, Reuters reported that the Financial Times claims that the US has been providing Ukraine with intelligence that enables Ukraine's long-range strikes to zero in on effective targets. How true this is remains to be seen, but there's no denying that Ukraine has enjoyed massive success with these strikes. Ukraine hits its targets more often than not, and that may be because the US is now giving it a helping hand. These kinds of attacks may still not be enough to push Putin away from his failed course when it comes to the Ukraine war. When asked if he sees the strikes leading to economic problems for Russia, Foreman points out that Putin can take on more debt, cut spending elsewhere, and continue to lean on Russia's national reserve. He adds that the likes of China and India buying Russian oil, as well as North Korea supplying Russia with weapons, all play in Putin's favor. But even with all of those caveats, Foreman still says to Times Radio,
"There's no doubt that Russia is under severe economic difficulties. But I don't think that Ukrainian drone strikes are going to bring about a collapse of the Russian economy on their own."
Perhaps not, but as Foreman says himself, those strikes coupled with concerted international action could collapse Russia's economy. And besides sanctions, there are hints that some in the EU are ready to do something that will really hurt Russia. Unfreeze Russia's frozen assets so that Ukraine can use them. Such a course of action will obviously help Ukraine, which is dealing with economic pressure of its own. However, they'll also take away another of Russia's economic lifelines, while once again showcasing how Putin's Ukraine war failures have ended up turning the geopolitical tide against his country. There is still a debate ongoing in the EU about how to use this frozen Russian money. The Straits Times says that EU leaders are weighing up the possibility of using those assets to deliver a loan of 140 billion euros, or about $150 billion to Ukraine. But this sort of action can only happen if the EU's various leaders unify to make the decision, as unity is the antidote to Putin's efforts to make Europe's many nations focus on themselves rather than Ukraine. Still, there might be one more issue that threatens to tear Russia apart more than any other, and that issue is the simple fact that Putin is a 73-year-old man who isn't going to live forever. Realistically, Russia's leader may only have a few more years to achieve his goals. But if Putin dies, there doesn't seem to be any sort of replacement for the cult of personality type figure, as Foreman dubs Putin waiting in the wings. Foreman is quick to mention that any major refresh between Russia and the West, which includes Ukraine, is likely a generation away. But Foreman also says that when it comes to Putin,
his prospect is to remain in power and then die and then leave it to his successor. I think the problem is that every day he remains in office, the chances of bloodshed when he finally dies and his successor comes along increases.
Putin's successor may not be so crazed about Ukraine, Foreman says, and a power struggle inside Russia could be just as damaging as anything that the West or Ukraine is doing to hurt Russia. Perhaps that's Putin's biggest failure of all. His seeming lacking of planning for what comes next is going to be a major problem for Russia. Putin seems to have recognized this, and as the Kyiv Independent reported in May, Russia's leader has a list of potential candidates to succeed him. But potential is the key word here. There is nobody whom Putin is obviously grooming to be his successor, and that fact is sending Russia headlong into a future dilemma. In September, Reuters reported on strange comment that Putin made to China's President Xi Jinping when Russia's leader attended a military parade in Beijing. Human organs can be continuously transplanted, Putin reportedly said through his translator. The longer you live, the younger you become, and you can even achieve immortality. Is Putin's solution to the succession problem simply not to die? Immortality may be on Putin's mind, but that's pure fantasy. And maybe this sort of comment is Putin's roundabout way of acknowledging his biggest failure of all. Russia's leader hasn't prepared his country for what comes after decades of Putin's rule. Organ transplants won't save Putin, and the many mistakes that Putin has made in Ukraine and within his own country will end up tearing Russia apart. That is, if Putin's domestic security blind spots inside Russia don't topple the country first. Russia's leader has been dedicating far too many of Russia's resources to Ukraine and now Europe, and that's another major error on his part. Find out why in our video. And remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering how Putin may be leading Russia down a path of destruction.